One Night at the Opera. Chapter 5. I found myself in a luxurious palace hall, one of many that lay along my path. They alternated like cards in a deck of cards, many after many, difficult to count. But now I stood before an exhibition on the theme of another well-known classical game. Chess was set up here. Enormous pieces, up to my chest in size. They occupied the spaces along the walls, on both sides, and there were significantly more pieces than in a normal game. And their set was clearly put together in disarray. Several kings instead of one, multiple queens, rooks, officers and knights. Not as many pawns as one might have expected. Black and white, standing opposite each other, as expected, on both sides of the hall. They complemented the row of ancient sculptures that were here. And who will play? I asked out loud to no one in particular. So far, there was no one in the room except me, and no one was in a hurry to appear. But suddenly, all the chess pieces were enveloped in magical sparks. I had seen similar awakenings before. Like inanimate objects gaining consciousness and becoming alive. The cups in the previous room came to life in much the same way. But here, including due to the larger scale of the pieces, everything happened much more spectacularly. The glow, rays and sparks illuminated the head of each piece, one by one, and at random, and when they fell, the piece revealed its face. In the place that you would call the head, a face appeared. Different faces, each piece has an individual one, even if the pieces themselves are the same, a unique personality appeared in every one. Someone began to jump in one place, someone immediately galloped forward, without waiting for anyone's command. The pieces seemed to have started a game, and even began to throw magical fire at each other, as if they were trying to beat each other and remove them from the field. I did not immediately figure out what to do. Or rather, at first I was simply at a loss. So, look, they will all kill each other. Here are the first victims. Some of them, obviously, the opponent managed to defeat. They left the common board somewhere in the far corners, and stood there mixed up, the beaten blacks and the beaten whites. I had to take this game under my command, at least somehow, but I didn't know how. In the end, I realized that the first thing I needed to do was choose a side. And I declared out loud that I intended to play white. Then all the pieces on the field froze, and stopped fighting in vain. The beaten ones began to return, and all of them began to return to their original squares, again arranging themselves in even rows. The chaos stopped. I waited until they finally took their positions, and made the first move with a pawn. There were no familiar rules in this game. Too much was going on around. And which of the kings should I protect, even if there were several of them? And when I noticed that the kings were fighting each other, coming very close, then my head completely stopped understanding the rules. Usually the kings couldn't collide with each other, every chess player knows this is a basic rule. But our rules were obviously different. Each piece had its own individual attack feature, and these features were divided into several main groups. Elemental elements, such as fire, water, light or something like a living shadow, or silver, each released some kind of energy impulses at the opponent. For the sake of interest, I counted more than 10 varieties of them. And no one prevented individual pawns from using exactly the same fire as other kings. And also, apparently, each piece had its own number of lives. Its own endurance, and maybe its own strength of this energy attack. No one fell from the first blow, and when I announced, for example, check, an energy battle began between the king and the opponent attacking him. Kings, more often than not, won. As did queens. There was a system here. After all, each chess piece has its own strength, measured in pawns. Knights and officers are considered 3 pawns, rooks, 4, or even 5. And the queen, all 8. I don't know how strong the king was valued here, but he certainly wasn't weaker than the queen. And that's how the battles happened. Each move, as a result of which the pieces crossed not even on one, but in the range of 3 nearby cells, they ended in a battle using a variety of energies. And what's most interesting is that from any hit the piece could also be pushed back, or vice versa, pulled forward, or shifted to the left or right. This led to continued movement along the cells, after the move, during the duel, which added even more complexity to the game. And when a piece was defeated, this time, it simply crumbled into dust, and the dust instantly dissipated and disappeared, without even tickling my nose. I was doused with such a cloud from under a rook, once, but it didn't even make me sneeze. The pieces disappeared, and their number in the room rapidly decreased. I realized that the one who had the last one left would win. And it didn't matter at all whether this piece was a pawn or a king. Simple logic told me that at the beginning of the game the forces were equal, even if the number of those and other pieces did not exactly match. In total, each side had the same number of pawns. I also noticed that duels were not the same between figures of different elements. But it was too difficult to figure this out without hints, and I did not even hope to understand everything. Although I noticed some logical patterns. Water had a strong effect on fire, as if extinguishing it. But wind attacks against flame, on the contrary, practically did not work. They could, apparently, on the contrary, kindle the fire even more strongly, and sometimes the attack restored the opponent's lives if the elements were combined in a certain way. There was no way to delve into this elemental magic on my own. How can I understand without help how exactly silver affects light or shadow? Logic clearly did not help here, and I tried to understand this through simple observation and experiments. But since figures of different strengths also collided, pawns against knights, and knights with queens and kings, I still constantly got confused. In the end, I came to the conclusion that I would not bother with the elements, but would simply hope that their influence was not so great. The game continued, and I had already used up half of the pieces. But on the other side there were a couple fewer, and this was very encouraging. The scales were constantly fluctuating, the advantage shifted from one side to the other several times during the whole time. But in the end, I managed to defeat my opponent, leaving behind even one living king, and an officer to boot. All the rest were beaten and scattered in the wind. Although, there was no wind in this hall. But the air was still very fresh and pleasant. Reminiscent of a torrential downpour outside. So my second personal test was taking place and completed. Elemental chess of a very large scale. And then, I opened the golden curtains that closed the doors, and I myself went into the next corridor, then a hall, several more empty halls, several more corridors. There was nothing to indicate that a new adventure awaited me in one of them, and I simply moved on. And then, I found myself in the right place, where a new test was already waiting for me.